Welcome to the Neurofaith Podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Curt Thompson, and we are here to explore what it means to live at the intersection of emerging scientific discoveries about the mind and following and being formed by Jesus, and how that can lead us into a world of greater human flourishing. The title for this, our first season, is Thinking Well During a Pandemic. We're eager to hear from our guests not only about the work they are doing, but how it speaks to what it means for us to thrive in our present particular moment. Today, my guest is Dr. Jim Wilder. Jim is, first of all, a friend of mine. He is a well-known neurotheologian. For those of you who've not heard that term before, we're going to talk about what that means today. He is a psychologist who has been both active clinically as well as one of the most prescient thought leaders in the field of interpersonal neurobiology and the questions around what does it mean for us to love God with all of our mind. But also, Jim's work has spanned the work of a number of different areas of brain science and questions of spiritual formation. And his work, both in terms of his written work, his spoken work, his leadership in workshops, as well as his willingness to be a friend to so many people who are in this field. I count it as an honor to have the opportunity to have a conversation with him today. His latest work is called Renovated. It is conversations with Dallas Willard and neuroscience, and what does it mean for us to be fully loved in our experience of God. I can't tell you how honored I am and how glad I am to be able to speak with Dr. Wilder today. Jim, welcome to the program.
Yes, thank you. It's good to be with you too, Dr. Thompson.
So, as is the case, you are this is the third in our series here in this first season of the Neurofaith Podcast, and we will get to this eventually. One of the things that we're also trying to highlight in this first season is questions around these different topics that we'll talk about and how that has been shaped and formed by the pandemic in particular as well. But before we get there, Jim, I'd love for our audience to hear more about the story. I love when I've heard you talk about these stories. I love these. And I think as we're introducing people to this notion of the mind, we're introducing people to what does it mean for us to be people who are paying attention to neuroscience and relationships and the brain and God's experience of us and us of him. I'd love for our audience to hear a bit about what was it that first drew you into this field, and how is it that you've come to be so passionate about it?
Well, it goes, back to very, very early roots. The first thing to me was that I had a sort of a spiritual crisis when I was 19, having grown up with parents who were missionaries. And hearing about God, I had always, sort of believed, but in fact, what I believed didn't seem to have much impact on my life. And so I had this crisis period when I decided to find out if God was really out there and interact with me. And in that time, I went back to the Bible and said, well, I'm just going to, instead of doing all the things I've been told to do, I'm just going to practice what it actually says to do in there. And I came up with three things. One was that you're supposed to talk with God about everything. And the impression was he'd answer you back. The second thing was that you were to do nothing out of fear. And the third was that you're supposed to love people deeply. And of course, that's what I was afraid of, was getting too close to people, because they're the ones that had hurt me. And so fast forward, now I get into psychology. I'm running or at least assistant director at that point in a community clinic, and we're helping all these people recovering from traumas of one sort or another. And we find that some of them are recovering and sustaining their recovery, and other ones, every time they come back, they've got the same issues going on. They're getting the same treatment, they have basically the same trauma. So the question in our mind is, what's the difference between the two of them? And so as what I would say a miraculous answer to prayer at that point, we were introduced to the brain science of identity formation, and came to the conclusion that the people who had significant attachments in their life that worked right were getting something from those attachments that they weren't really picking up in therapy that helped them throughout the week. And the brain development, gave us those details of what it was they were learning. But the significant point was, unless there's somebody that's attached to you in a meaningful kind of a way, these skills aren't acquired, and they're all based on joy and good relationships. And turns out that's what forms the human identity to begin with. And at that point, I became quite aware that that wasn't the way that we were introducing Christianity into people's lives, and hadn't been the way it come into my life either. It came in the form of beliefs. So I got very passionate about putting these things together. I said, whatever God tells us is true and turns out to be the way the brain works and learns things like identity, that's something that ought to get some careful attention, because those overlaps have got to be pointing to some really significant things we should be learning and implementing better.
Right. I love how you write in Renovated about attachment love. That term and its concepts have begun to make its way into the general population a little more frequently. But your particular take on this reflection on attachment and what we learn about Scripture, and how does Scripture in particular talk about this particular kind of love? There's a particular word, the Hebrew word that you like, that you so poignantly pointed out to your readers. I'd love for you to talk a little bit about what is so important about attachment, and give us just a little primer on how that works, and what is it about attachment love that makes such a difference for us.
Yeah, that's another way to introduce another one of the elements in this story as well, and that is one of my early supervisors there was Jane Willard, and her husband, Dr. Dallas Willard, who's half of the book there, Renovated, came into our office to talk to the staff, and he said, the psychology, that's the care of souls, and the most important question in the care of souls is, do you love them? Now, that really severely messed me up.
Oh, my goodness.
Because I had been taught in graduate school that the thing to do about it as a psychologist was to form no attachments to anyone, and stayed, sort of distant and disconnected from people, let them process their, it's very important not intrude into their process at all. But if that's the kind of psychology I was practicing, this very hands-off kind of psychology, and what really was getting the profound change was somebody that was being loved and connected to as sort of a shared life experience. That challenged my beliefs pretty badly. So I went back to looking at what the Bible had to say, and saying, is there a word, is there anything in the Bible that really refers to a very secure, ongoing attachment to another person, which you won't let them go, and shares life with them, always with the intention of making their life better? What would that be called? In psychological terms, that'd be the kind of attachment that forms between a mother and a child, between us and our dog. It crosses species and stuff like that. But once it's connected in the mind, it's irreplaceable. So I'm thinking in the Bible, this would have to be the kind of love that shouldn't be replaced with anything else. And every time we come back to it in the Old Testament, there was this word chesed that talked about this sort of unfailing, undying, well-intentioned, for our good and purpose, love that God showed for us, and that we were supposed to show for each other. And every time there were loyal relationships in the Bible, chesed was the word used for it. And then moving to the New Testament, there's always been this mystery about the word agape. It's not a common word in Greek, and why were they using it in the New Testament? And it appears that when the word chesed in the Old Testament is translated into Greek by the New Testament writers, they use the word agape.
How about that?
So I'm thinking, hey, we got this same connection.
Right.
It's this connection with an irreplaceable other who has good in mind, good intentions for you. And that's what every good parent, every good husband and wife, every good lover of God is supposed to be growing in. So we should pay attention.
Now, I want to say that, you and I both know that we live in a world in which knowing stuff is really important.
Yeah.
And somehow if I just say to you, I love you, if we hear it preached from a pulpit, God loves you, somehow, yeah, even though we're not announcing this explicitly, we're living almost tacitly as if the fact that you now have access to that information somehow should be enough. What is it? Would you say? Like, and even feel free to talk a little bit about what's happening in the brain. What makes the difference between this? We who think that knowledge is really the most important thing, having more knowledge, more information. What is the big difference between this sense of knowledge and this Hesed attachment that you're talking about?
Well, the simplest way of distinguishing it is that knowledge, what we know, what Michael Polanyi, the philosopher, might have called tacit knowledge, the things that we know but we can't explain exactly how we know them, they operate in sort of a right hemispheric dominant kind of a way. And most of our words and stuff like that is trying to put into words the things that we already know. And most of us can remember, even with the word love, remember, like, how do I actually put into words something that I feel deeply inside? And when you do that, the word love ends up coming up kind of shallow. And we've all had that experience. We know what it's like. What are the deeper things that run? They're the meaning, and meaning is pretty widely distributed throughout the brain, whereas words are very sort of
Very localized.
Yeah, very localized. And it's so in the brain, there's always meaning in search of words. The problem is that with the Enlightenment came the idea that, it was Damasio that pointed it out in one of the early books, and that was part of the revolution in how we understand the human brain, that Descartes made the statement, I think, therefore I am. And that moved philosophy in the direction of thinking what I think, which at this point we're only talking about conscious thoughts, right? We actually think in a much broader spectrum than what we can pull it into conscious thoughts. So it's all thinking, but conscious thoughts got priority. Theology kind of got influenced by that, and so it's what you believe that became, our faith or our belief is sort of how we define religion, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
What are your beliefs? What are your faith? As opposed to what are your loves? Who are you loving? Who are you attached to? And in cases of my family, I've watched them, love someone, get divorced, and then love someone else, and notice how strongly what they believed was influenced by who they love. And most of us have watched that happen in people's lives. If you want to get into the part of your brain that controls your belief, now we've got to talk about the loves. And that is the part of the brain that does the attachment. It's like, who is significant to me? And when we do that, we actually have this right brain to right brain communication that runs faster than conscious thought, that creates sort of a mutual mind space in which, I kind of know what you're thinking and you know what I'm thinking, and neither one of us has put it in words yet.
Right. Exactly. And I'm struck by this notion of how in the Gospels we so often read that Jesus knew what was in their hearts. We read that statement, and I think that reading that statement through the lens of a modernist perspective, through the lens of an Enlightenment perspective, there's this sense in which we imagine that Jesus magically kind of knows a fact. He knows certain stuff, as opposed to him being so deeply connected to the people around him in ways that there were even places literally even in his own body, and things that he sensed and imaged that he could pick up on because he was paying so much more attention to people around him and the world around him through the lens of attachment, through the lens of meeting people in their right hemisphere with his right hemisphere. At least this is how I imagine that was taking place. And then this notion of how he then pulls people along right brain to right brain, as opposed to trying to shoehorn facts from the left brain into the right brain to get people to somehow magically change behavior just because they have new information.
Yeah, as a matter of fact, Jesus was pretty mysterious about a lot of his information. He was always talking in parables, which convey meaning to the right hemisphere in terms of the images they use, but the left hemisphere is sometimes left, kind of like, huh? What are you talking about here?
Exactly. That would have been. I'm not quite sure why we don't read more of that in the Gospels. Like why we don't just like in the English translations. And the people said, "Huh?"
Yeah.
Because it's so frequently it's the very thing that we feel that is taking place. One of the things that I notice is how we can become so familiar with the gospel in terms of what we kind of read on paper that we don't necessarily then recognize the tacit underlying message that Jesus is trying to get to. One of the things that I know that you and your colleagues have done is that you have really taken this notion of attachment love, of Hesed love, and you've also explored the way particular spiritual disciplines can enhance that experience. I wonder if you could speak to our audience a little bit about this notion of how do we develop and mature in this realm of Hesed love through the implementation of certain spiritual practices, and maybe give us one or two examples of how that operates.
Sure. The thing about spiritual disciplines is that they're activities that primarily make room in our mind for something relational to happen with God. They clear room, like fasting or quiet or just meditation. A lot of that is pulling out of the way the stuff that would otherwise be running through our brain consistently. And what our brain is not terribly well trained to do is to notice thoughts that come from God.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And in fact, our brain has systems that are primarily operating over in the right hemisphere that are we've called the relational circuits. I think the term was first created by Carl Lehman. But it's the things that help us to be aware interpersonally. And the interesting thing about that is that those are the same systems in our brain that give importance to something. So we can actually read or hear a verse or hear a thought from God, and if we're not in a relational frame of mind, we'll just be annoyed by it.
Mm-hmm.
I remember my mother, when my brother and I would start fighting, she would start to sing, "Be ye kind to one another," and it would just annoy
It's like throwing gasoline on the fire.
Oh yeah. But as she sang on, we would begin to, get into a relational frame of mind. Remember, that's my mother singing, and I'd look at my brother, and he'd look at me, and we'd go like, "Yeah, well, we do like it better when we're kind." And she would actually sing us back into this relational frame of mind, but it would start out being very annoying because we were both in a non-relational state. And this is the problem, that you can quote the Bible to somebody who's in a non-relational state and they'd be nothing but irritated by you. Whereas if you're feeling relationally connected to God, like remembering times when you're pretty sure that God was touching your life, you're feeling thankful, you're feeling relational, you're feeling connected, you're curious, the prefrontal cortex is on you. What could God mean by that? And in that framework, we're able to connect with God and with others. And that is what the spiritual disciplines are meant to do, make room for this relational connection. But a lot of times people are just practicing the disciplines, have been disappointed because now they've got space, but they don't know what to notice should be in that space.
I'd love for you to speak to our audience a little bit about the connection between our having had traumas that necessarily take place often in the context of intimate human relationships. And those traumas frequently will shape our imagined relationship with God. I'd love for you to speak a little bit about the degree to which we can notice or experience a shift in our relationship with God by having a different kind of relationship with another human being or community of human beings that can more directly connect my brain to theirs, such that I can begin to imagine a renewed or different relationship with God that heretofore I couldn't, because if God is anything like human beings, then I don't want anything to do with God. I'd love for you to hear, to talk a little bit about how it is that our relationship with human beings invites us into a space where we are able to imagine a relationship with God that is different than the one that we've had in the past.
Well, it's absolutely fascinating how this theory of mind center of the brain, which is primarily in the cingulate cortex, develops between about 2 months of age and 5 months of age, by which a baby can look at a face and realize there's a mind behind the face that they're looking at. And they do that if the mother or whoever they're training from is trustworthy, so that what they're displaying on their face is authentic and true, and it's like, this is what I really feel about you, and and there's a wide range of experiences. Now that becomes your interpreter for what other minds are like. And if you have a trauma, then it takes some section of that, what other minds are like, and says, that mind doesn't have my best interests at heart. It's not chesed, to use the Old Testament term. And so when we look at what a mind is thinking or saying, we interpret the motives based on how this little interpreter runs. So if our interpreter says people are always up to no good, and we look at God and we try to read, really, it's really amazing we can understand anything about God, because God is a mind so much bigger than ours, right? I sometimes think about it if I was trying to explain computers to a flea.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
I think that's what most people who are working with computers, when they're talking to me, I think that's who they actually think they're talking with. They think they're talking with a flea.
There's a gap there for sure.
Yeah, believe me, you have no idea.
Yeah. So you get this, you get a metaphor going or something like that, and you hope the flea follows along with that. Well, if we're trying to understand God-type thoughts, we're really not going to grasp them very thoroughly. But in this interpreter that's trying to figure out what it is that this greater mind is telling us, if we don't trust that mind to be honest, that the interpreter says they're always lying, they're up to something else, it's really, really hard to feel connected with God, because there'll always be doubts and worries running around. So what we want to do, God does reveal himself, but he's often mystifying. And now we need to practice with another mind. Could that actually work? Mm-hmm. Could someone actually have good intentions for me? I remember one point in our counseling center, we were seeing about 1,200 appointments a month of sexually abused women. And my office happened to be near the front of the building, and they would dread walking past my office, because in their mind all men were predators. And so they would gather at the other end of the hall till they got a group of 8 to 15 of them, and then they'd come rushing past my office, shooting me really dirty looks, because in their mind, they're protecting themselves from this horrible predator at the end of the hall. This is a sign of what we can do to God. We can, just try to make sure that, I don't know how many people have said, I heard that if God heard that I liked anything too well, he'd take it away from me. Mm-hmm. That sort of a thing. He's just out to find anything that I might find pleasurable. And so we're in our minds, we're hiding from this, this very grouchy. But if we practice with another person we begin to see in them actually what God sees in them, they see in us what God sees in us, it gives us a chance to grow a whole new interpreter. But we have to practice that with the brain. We have to have a person to practice with the things that God might reveal to us. It sort of works from both sides.
Right. You've taken these concepts. We've talked about attachment love. We've talked about the way the brain works, right brain to right brain. This notion of having a shared mind space, and this has gone on to become, in its most, in its fullest form, what you call the life model. I would love for our listeners to hear more about this because I'd love for them to have greater access to it, and love for you to talk a little bit about how the life model came to be and what that's been like for you to watch that flourish over the time that it has.
That's a fascinating story for me. Back in about the middle of the 1980s, we realized that there was a different treatment protocol for everything that was going on, so that if someone had an addiction, at that point the Minnesota model was really growing, and it's like you get in their front face, you confront them, you tell them they're going to die if they don't change, and you don't let up until they hit the bottom. And then at the same time, we had other people who were in trauma, and you say, no, trauma, you always support, you never confront. You take very good care from them. Some of the Christian counselors saying, well, we pray for healing, and the Holy Spirit comes on them. Others say we cast the demons out. The people who are in the addiction recovery say, well, we can't use medication, that's a drug. And another group was saying, we need drugs to help people with depression. And so what happens if you have a depressed trauma victim who needs support and deal with their addiction and something for their depression? There was no model that took care of all of that. And so we were trying to find an integrated model. We invited about 30 people from different schools of thought, from ministries, prayer, healing, psychiatry, social work. And we said, we want to hear what works, because at the intersection of what's making a difference in people's lives, there must be some things we need to notice. And the question that everybody is trying to answer, whether you're planting a church or raising children, is how do we raise people, or how do we create people, or how do we heal people to become the ones that God was intending for them to be? So there had to be some model for life, what it should look like, where are we all headed, that we should agree on, and then we could look at the steps that get us there. So a few years of meeting intermittently as this group, we began to pull together the process, which included one of maturity. Really well-developed 3-month-old looks different than a really well-developed 3-year-old, than a 13-year-old or a 30-year-old, and so on. So this model across life of what it would look like became a multi-generational thing. In order to get this to happen, there's things people have to do, and there's stuff that has to be provided by their communities, and things that need to come from God. And it just became a whole lot of fun to put this together. Then come a late 1990s, the brain science came in, and it's like, hey, here's something that tells us, and this is the science of Alan Shore, the same dates that we've developed from the Bible and from observation that changes go on in cultures and families and identities match changes in the brain. And suddenly we have this overlap. And the amazing ingredient that came out of that was, it all develops in response to either joy, when it develops well, or fear, and then it develops abnormally. So, this goes back to what God told me originally, don't do anything out of fear.
Right.
That'll warp you.
Right. Fear not.
And so now this group began to say, okay, well, now we've got the science now of how it should have developed. Is it possible to go back and remediate that? Can we do it later? And if so, what do we need to make that work? And that's been our experiment for the last 25 years, probably, figuring out ways to make this work in community. And so now we can integrate to a fairly significant degree, how do you grow a church with how do you heal from trauma to how do you deal with what medications you might happen to need if your nervous system isn't running right.
Right. Even as people are listening to this, each person hears what we are talking about. Each person hears these words of encouragement and hope that you're offering. And I, as the listener, find myself thinking, oh, this is great. This is what I'm having to do, what I have to do. And whether I know it or not, I can sometimes find myself living as if I'm still having to do this on my own, that I'm ultimately responsible for this without actually really capturing the notion that my joy, my healing really does require the engagement with other people. One of the things that you talk about in your work, especially as you think about the healing, not just of individuals, but the formation of mature people of faith, is this notion of intergenerational connections. And, we live in a world that is now continually, increasingly separated, not just individuals from individuals, but generations from generations for all kinds of social reasons. I would love to hear you talk a little bit more about the significance that you're finding and the importance of what is it that being in an intergenerational connected community does for people that we have found a way to forget in our modern time.
Well, that is a big hairball you just put out on the table right there.
Oh, great. I love hairballs.
There's so many elements to that right there. At this point, the average person is spending, I think, somewhere between 8 and 12 hours a day looking at a computer screen of some kind, whether it's a TV or something else. Very significant thing about computer screens is that pre-recorded program material is very interested in having you follow the material. It doesn't care about you and what you're thinking at all. When you're interacting with another human being, that interaction runs well as long as both of you are interested. So we're basically training our brains for huge amounts of time each day to interact with things that aren't interested in us. And in so doing, we're not developing the skills about being interested in someone else and how do you do this in real time. And so one of the side effects, actually, of the COVID isolation is that people have found a certain degree of fatigue and exhaustion and even depression, having reduced all of their time to talking to screens. Even if there's a person on the other end of the screen, there's a lag that's introduced there by the internet that keeps us from really connecting well with others. And people are beginning to realize, hey, I think I need a more connection with other people than I thought I needed. I was pretty satisfied with my busy life. So I think there's been a little increase going back into that need. But the thing about our identity, and we haven't really talked much about our identity, but the best parts of our brain, let's say the prefrontal cortex, are all about figuring out what it's like me and my people to do right now in this kind of circumstance, which is constantly changing. So we're having to sort of reinvent ourselves as we go along so that we act in ways that are really satisfying to us. And that's what the prefrontal cortex tries to figure out. So it has a lot of mirror neurons in our identity. Most of what's in our identity is built up of these mirror neurons. Now, the complication with that is your brain then isn't configured to know who I am based on looking at myself.
Exactly.
It's based on knowing who I am if someone else is looking at me and telling me that's who I am. So to really have a good identity, we have to have people around us who can recognize who we really are. And further, we need brains that know something that we don't about being human. And we certainly can use brains that know more than we do about computer, but if we never become like them, it doesn't bother our brain very much. It's like, I'm glad you're around. But about being human, now we need somebody who can show us ways of being human. And primarily that means staying connected with you while you or I are upset. That's
Exactly.
what disrupts us. So if I'm sad, if I'm angry, if I'm hurt, if I'm lonely, can we stay connected when that's going on? And if so, I learn how to be human from somebody that knows something more than I do. And that's this multi generational community. And furthermore, and this might be a quick corner to go around, am I just the person who has to receive everything, or do I have something to give? And if I have something to give, I need someone who's downstream from me, who's not quite as mature as I am. So I can receive this from someone who knows more than I do. But now I become the one who knows more, and I can pass this on to somebody else. And we're basically teaching each other everything that we know about how to be, everything a human being was designed to be, our best human, you might say.
Right. So I'm hearing you talk about when we talk about maturity, when we think about education, and we think about, well, I'm going from first grade to second to third, and then senior in high school, and then wherever else I'm going in my education, there is a sense in which we kind of tacitly assume that this means that I'm just receiving more and more and more from whoever is upstream from me, whoever has more information than I do, whether it's a student or whoever, that's what growth in knowledge is. That's what, we can come to believe that that's what it means to become more mature. But you're talking about maturation. And it sounds like, as I'm hearing you say, that maturation isn't just me receiving from people who are upstream from me. That maturation is a process wherein which I'm both receiving from people who know things I don't. And by know, I don't just mean information. I mean people with whom I'm experiencing these relational encounters, wherein which there are even ruptures that we repair.
Mm-hmm.
And at the same time, I'm also giving away downstream to others. People are receiving from me. There is this aspect of being a conduit and not just a bucket that's being constantly poured into. I'm a conduit. Yes, I'm receiving, but I'm also giving away. And that it requires me to be in a community wherein which I'm receiving from people who are more mature than me, giving away to people who are less mature than me in any given moment at that time, if I'm hearing you correctly.
Yes, I believe you're exactly right there. One of the side effects of the Industrial Revolution on education was that we needed children to know a bunch of stuff, but we also had to put them in a parking lot where they didn't do anything significant until they got to be 18 or 20 and we could put them in the workforce. If you go back to what we consider more primitive societies, hunters and gatherers, and people who live in community, you'll find that children are engaged from the second they are old enough to do something and taking care of the community. So you give them the cookies, they take it to grandma, or whatever else, a part of the ongoing process of life. And that's what we're really talking about, restoring back into our culture, where we're actually, as soon as I've got some goodness, because now we're not talking about jobs or skills, we're talking about identity. I'm full of life. If I'm getting more life in me, I should immediately get a chance to help you get more life in you.
Mm-hmm.
That's what keeps us alive. That makes us wake up and want to be part of the next day. And that process is relational. And even up to 100 years ago, we were all living in multi-generational homes. Most people couldn't work after age 40 because they were disabled by their jobs, which were pretty, brutal jobs. And so the older people were in the home and they required care, but they also taught you how to be human and how to treat other people. And the church should be part of restoring that, because it's one of the places where we have a chance for multi-generational community. And so this is the discussion I want to have us getting engaged with. If we get fascinated with how to do this better, communities will figure out ways to do it.
Couldn't agree more. And I think that for our listeners, all these things that you've been describing are words of great hope. You've already spoken to, you've touched on this notion of how being in the middle of a pandemic has, in some respects, shaped even more powerfully our penchant toward isolation, our being on screens and so forth. I'm wondering if there's any other word that you might have for us, the things that you're seeing in particular about our being in a pandemic. And then what words of hope would you have for us in particular relative to what we've been talking about that we can think about as we kind of come out of this phase of the pandemic where we happen to be at the moment, not knowing exactly where this is going to go, even though we might have some sense of that. Would love to hear any other reflections that you have in particular about what this, all that you're talking about, how does this speak to our lives in our current time in particular?
Well, I would say that, we've got a bunch of depressed youth because that's the time in life when you really want to be active and making a difference in the world. And you don't feel like you're making a big difference in the world if you're just watching social media and trying to see whether you get likes. That makes you like, I'm waiting to receive something as opposed to I've got something to give. So we need to figure out ways to help youth do worthwhile things during this time. And that became an obvious need. But the other thing that you haven't mentioned, and that is the degree to which there's become to be separation or alienation between families and whole groups. Most churches have lost half of their members, either over masks or vaccines, or not saying anything about masks or vaccines. The last political campaign has huge numbers of families not talking with each other. If it isn't the mask issue, it's something else. We have reached the point at which it's becoming critically obvious that we feel someone isn't on our side. Basically, our brain has put them in as an enemy mode. They're not on my side. They're not going to connect with me. All we can do is cut them off and defriend them, unfriend them, not go to their house anymore, don't call me anymore. This is becoming a huge problem in our world, and it goes back to what we were talking about earlier, and that is, how do we go about connecting with somebody? And this is the nature of Hesed. I stick with you even if we've got some problems in our relationship. I keep the relationship bigger than the problem.
Mm-hmm.
And instead of figuring out, who's right on the vaccine issue, we are in much bigger need of figuring out how do we keep good relationships even if we don't agree on the vaccine or whatever else it might be. That is the thing that we need to be discussing. And obviously at this point, we have to say most churches have no answers. They don't know how to repair, as you mentioned earlier. So the wonderful thing about the brain is once it knows a solution is possible, it goes about starting to figure it out.
Right.
So it is possible to keep relationships bigger than problems. And if we simply got together and started figuring out how are we going to do this, we got the kind of brains that are going to be making progress on that issue. And I think first hope is to say, let's reintroduce into the environment that the thing that's most important to your brain is to have good attachments.
Indeed.
Any other issue can be less than that.
Which brings us full circle back to where we started. And Jim, I just want to thank you ever so much for your kindness in joining us today. You have been speaking of life model, you've been a model for me. I'm grateful for the opportunity to count you as a friend. I'm glad for our opportunity to speak here today to our audience. Again, I want to just highlight the life model from Dr. Jim Wilder and his colleagues, and also his most recent two books, The Other Half of Church and Renovated. I would invite you to check those out. Jim, is there a way for people to, what's a way for them to reach you or to contact you or find out more about your work?
Well, they can go to lifemodelworks.org. That's a good place to find central information right there. And I appreciate you sending folks that way so we can begin to work on this again more as a community. The more minds we have working on how to keep our relationships bigger than our problems, the better we're going to be. And I really appreciate you having me on this podcast. Your relationship and your work has been one of the big encouragements for me over the last decade and a half, because you're you're helping people to be authentic about being together. That's a topic we didn't bring up, but how do you form good attachments when you're not authentic? And I think your work has a lot to do with what keeps us authentic and the kind of shame that keeps us from going there. And so again, thank you for what you're bringing to the field.
Jim, you're most welcome. Again, thank you so much for being with us. And thank you to our audience for joining us on another episode of NeuroFaith. Join us again for our next time together. We look forward to being with you.